Well, if you hadn't heard by now, last week we had 468 or 86 children here and over 200 adults in Vacation Bible School. It was a joyous and glorious time. There was lots of really exciting things going on here. So when I started to wonder what I would preach on this week, I looked at the VBS texts. It seemed to make the most sense to me. And so I picked Daniel for today. Most of the time we don't hear about Daniel. Daniel is one of these obscure books. Very few people actually even know all of the story of Daniel. It's rather interesting, almost what we would consider science fiction in our day and age, but it's a prophetic book and it's filled with wonderful stories. Daniel himself and the Hebrew people at the very beginning of the story find themselves in exile. They're exiled to Babylon. Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of the fiery furnace fame, find themselves in this place enrolled in the Babylonian education system, or BISD, the Babylonian Independent School District. While they're there, they are taught about the values, traditions, and norms of that culture. And that happens for them because the Babylonians intend to assimilate them into their culture. So there are two things that happen for all of these Hebrews that are with Daniel. Now let me note here that Daniel and his friends and a group of other people are counted among the best and the brightest of the Hebrew people. So they're not with the common, ordinary, everyday people. They are in fact staying in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. These people are the elites of their society, and that's where these Hebrew people find themselves. And so first, they're taught the language of that culture. And anybody who knows anything about language knows that language includes worldview. It helps form our worldview. It helps shape how we use our words and what those words mean. And so it was very important for the Babylonians to teach their language to any of the people who they took captive. Because in this way, those people moved from their own worldview, for instance, the Jewish worldview, to the Babylonian worldview. And the Babylonians understood that that would take about 3 years. And so this education system took 3 years so that this transformation of worldview could take place. Now, if you're wondering if that was just for them, just for the Babylonians, I would tell you to recall the fact that in the early church, in the early Christian church, before an adult could be baptized, they had to be part of a 3-year catechism class, which taught them the traditions and the values of the Christian life and faith. So the church actually borrowed that system from the earliest cultures in the world that had already figured out that it takes about 3 years to transfer worldview. So it's not just in your head, but it becomes part of your normal way of living and being and moving in the world that you live in. The other way the Babylonians helped educate the Hebrew people was by this exclusion, one from the other, the elites, or the best and the brightest from the common people. And that meant that for those people who were considered the best and the brightest, they got to live in pretty much the lap of luxury. Their life was easy, and they were given the best choice food and wine to eat and drink. Daniel understood that this captivity and the giving in to the ways of Babylon would come at a great price to himself and to his people. And so listen now in Daniel 1, starting with the 8th verse, what Daniel chooses to do. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him not to defile himself. Now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to Daniel, "I am afraid of the Lord my king. He has appointed your food and your drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men of your own age, you would endanger my head with the king." Then Daniel asked the guard whom the palace master had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now let me just say that is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but the Babylonians had power, so they changed from the Jewish names to the Babylonian names. "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations and deal with your servants according to what you observe." So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. So the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom. Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Food. We all like to eat. Food and the rationing of food was a source of power and control in Babylon. He who controlled the food had the power. And Daniel understood this in a really unique way. He knew that the people that were common people living on the streets or in their hovels, he knew that they were eating, but he also knew that they were not eating the quality of food that he was receiving, nor were they eating the quantity of food that he would and his friends would be receiving in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. He understood that those people, those poor people, got only the leftovers, and they got the choicest and richest foods and drinks. It's hard for us, I think, in this day and age to understand what it means to be part of a food rationing system. But the truth is if we think about it long enough, we understand that in a very real way, we as a culture still ration food. I mean, certainly for most of us, we have the opportunity to go to any number of grocery stores and buy whatever food in whatever quantity we want. But consider for a moment those poor and needy among us who rely on food banks to get some of their sustenance. Somebody chooses not only what they will eat, but how much they will receive. And that is only after they have qualified to receive what somebody else has determined is enough for them. Or think, for instance, of the fact that in conversations in churches over the years, and I know I'm not alone in this, some of us have talked about what goes into the Thanksgiving meal baskets or boxes that people get. I remember someone saying to me once that we should be careful about the kind of pumpkin we're putting in those boxes because, after all, those people, read poor people, cannot afford to buy those kinds of brands, and so we shouldn't be giving that to them. I worked with a summer school lunch program for children that could not get food regularly, and they were part of the free and reduced lunch program in their schools. And there were a lot of discussions about putting less peanut butter on their peanut butter and jelly sandwiches because, we needed to watch how much of that we gave away. And then, let's not also, talking about free and reduced lunch programs, let's not forget that ketchup is a vegetable. We ration food, even in our culture today, whether we like to admit that or not. Daniel would have understood this very specifically and uniquely because he had an ancestor that rationed food, and his name was Joseph. In the story of Joseph that we read in Genesis, we see a man who, as a young boy, was arrogant and immature, who interpreted dreams, And as a result of all of those things, found himself in a world of trouble with his own family whose brothers tried to dispose of him because of his lack of maturity and other things that he was doing. Over Joseph's lifetime, Joseph ends up in Egypt. Also, a series of things happen to him that are not really good for him, but ultimately, he ends up gaining the favor of Pharaoh. During that relationship, Pharaoh has a dream that Joseph interprets, and he says that there's a famine coming on the land. And so the Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of the food. Joseph is now in control of all the crops and all the livestock. And he does it by forcing people to give those things to him. Not just the Egyptian livestock and crops, but the crops and livestock of his own people, the Hebrew people, basically enslaving an entire nation. Joseph wielded his power at will over the food. Theologian Walter Brueggemann actually says that Joseph was a Jewish sellout to his own people. That might be open for debate, but at the end of the day, Joseph controlled the food. Joseph had the power. Daniel understood this. And so Daniel, with the wisdom that God gave him, decided that he would not be part of this privileged food system that he was entitled to just because of his status with Nebuchadnezzar, with the culture that he was brought into. Joseph decided that that privilege was a privilege he would not take part of. And so it was his way to speak truth to power, that the truth that the ruling elite class of Babylon had for him was not something that he was going to embrace. He just said no. And so he chose to do that by saying, I will eat vegetables and drink water, and so will my friends. There was a choice to be made there. Now, for those of us sitting in this place, we might think, if we know just enough about Jewish law, that all they were really doing was partaking in the Jewish law by saying that this food would be unclean, and so we're just not going to eat that food. But I don't believe that's right. I believe that Daniel made a choice to not partake of the privilege of the powerful people around him that controlled the food. Because if they controlled the food, then they had power over him, and he was not going to have any of that. There was no indication in this story that the vegetables that Joseph got, that Joseph received and his friends received every day, were not previously given to the gods of Babylon. So for all Joseph knew, the vegetables he was getting were unclean because they had already been sacrificed to the idols. And there's no indication that says that that Daniel was a Nazarene, and so he could have drank the wine. There's no law that says he couldn't drink wine. I think what Daniel did was that he said, I am going to live by the faith that the community that I grew up in passed on to me. It was a faith that was grounded in the loving kindness of a God who had promised to never forsake his people, even when they were held captive in foreign nations. Daniel chose to be faithful, even as he learned the language and customs of the culture he lived in. He was really the example of what it meant to be living in the world, yet not being of the world. I am sure that he learned how to speak the language of Babylon. I am sure he understood the traditions and values that they had. But yet he continued throughout his life, and as you read his story, to say, I am a Hebrew. I was born a Hebrew. I was called by God as one of the chosen people. We, in captivity, are still God's chosen people, and we are not going to be the people that go along to get along. Instead, Daniel controlled the food, which meant that God had power. God had the power. I don't think that if Daniel was living today, he would have chose any differently. I think in this room, we can all agree that the world that we live in today is really not much different than that world that Daniel found himself in. If anything, some of us would say it's more violent, more divisive, and even more selfish than in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. But what are we doing about the choices that God has given us? Daniel used the freedom and power that God gave him to say no to the cultural norms of Babylon so that he could retain his identity as a child of the living God. But what about us? What would it take for us to speak truth to the power structures of this world whose cultures, whose norms and values are so different than what God has called us to do and who God has called us to be? What would it be like for us to just say no to some of the things that we are doing both consciously and unconsciously in our world today? There are statistics that say that most people spend 4 hours a day with their face in a screen. Now, I'm not talking about email at work, and I'm not talking about reading a book. I'm talking about things like social media, playing games. 4 hours a day. Are we going along to get along because everybody else is doing it? Is that what we do? Or is there some point where we say the food of the culture, the things that we're being fed that are normative, are not something that we need to partake in? When was it okay for us to begin to leave our phones on the dinner table? When was the last time that we had a conversation with a friend or a spouse or a sibling or even our child where we actually either had our phones off, oh my gosh, it has an off button, or we didn't even bring it with us? When was the last time we unplugged and actually helped build a relationship with another human being? Or how about that sending the kids outside to play or the grandkids outside to play? What would it mean to unplug the game system from the television set and say, instead of playing virtual football on TV, you're going outside to learn how to throw a football? Not at school, but in the backyard. When did it become okay to have our face in a screen for 4 hours? Even our cars are equipped with screens now. A new car has a screen in the back, a lot of back seats. I see them at night as I'm driving by them, and there's children in the back watching TV. What's wrong with looking at the world that we live in from the window and seeing the beauty of the earth, or noticing the people that are walking on the streets in our neighborhoods and in our cities around us? How many times have any of you gone out to dinner and looked at people sitting at tables and you know they're on a date, right? This isn't a couple that's been married or together for 100 years. These are people that might have known each other for a few months, and they're sitting at a table in a restaurant, and they've spent more time texting and checking their social media than talking to one another at the table while their food is getting cold, I might add. My husband and I usually just look at that and ponder what our relationship would have been like almost 30 years ago if that's how we started out. Our downtime is robbing us of the food, of healthy relationships. It has turned us, instead of being compassionate people, it's turned us into callous people who no longer care about what's happening in someone else's life. Who's feeding us? What is the food that we're choosing to eat? And when did that become okay? The food of our culture tells us that it is okay to have privilege without awareness, that it's okay to have overindulgence without responsibility. The food of our faith, however, tells us that our lives are meant to be lived for the other, so that we're not bloated, lazy people, but that we're actually people that pour ourselves out for the sake of the other who lives and breathes and moves among us, so that the other might have a full and abundant life just like all of us do. It is the food that makes us whole and holy. It's the food that reminds us that there is more to life than what we can touch with our hands or see with our eyes. It's the food that brings us joy and peace and love. Daniel stands as a witness that it is possible to say no to the values and norms of a culture that believes in survival of the fittest. Not as a philosophical conversation about animals, but as something that we practice every day. When did that happen? When did our self-interest become more important than the interest of the community that lives around us, that undergirds our understanding of who we are and whose we are? Whose food are we eating? Who has power over our lives? There is another food that we are offered that is life, that is life-giving, that is life-sharing. And we will participate in the meal where that food is served in a very little while. When we come to the table that our King Jesus has set for us, we will continue to have the choice, the freedom and the power to make a choice about what food we will eat. Will we choose the callous food that hardens our hearts and leaves us standing alone? Or will we choose a meal that is grounded in grace, that is open to all people, in all nations, in all places, for all time? Will we eat the food that makes us whole and holy? This is the choice that God gives us every single day. It's the food of faithfulness. It's the food that demands something of us, that we leave our hearts and our minds open, that we allow grace to be poured into us so that we might love one another as we have been loved. So will you come to this table today? Will you eat of this food? May we all be found to be faithful, not just today, but every single day. For if we control the food we eat, God continues to have all the power. And for each one of us, and for all people, that is really good news.